master of McLaughlin College, and I have just a couple of organizational things to say before we get underway with the reason you all came. First, for any students in the room, if you have not already signed in and registered at the doorway, please do. The reason is that we want to give you a certificate of participation if you attend 6 or more of these lunch talks throughout the year. And the way we know if you have attended 6 or more is if you have signed in on 6 or more occasions. So even if you don't know if you'll ever come back again, and we hope you do, please sign in. Secondly, you are part of something exciting and new. The university is constantly looking for more assessment of how well we do what we do. And so we have developed an assessment form that will be really simple for you to say whether you liked today's session and what you liked about it, and what further sessions you would be interested in coming in to attend, either more about this kind of a topic or some other sort of topic. That gives us ideas about what we can try to respond to. So please, before you leave, take 30 seconds to fill in this form. The last organizational thing is to say that some of these lunch talks are organized in collaboration with the York Collegium on Practical Ethics, and this is one of those. We really value the input and participation of the Collegium, and today's talk is an example of practical ethical issues that really enliven the McLaughlin community. So rather than me introducing the topic, I would like to introduce a member of the York Collegium on Practical Ethics, my predecessor as master of the college, Ian Green.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to introduce Danielle Thibodeau. She was one of our students in the Master of Public Policy, Administration and Law program and graduated in 2014. She was one of my students in Canadian Public Law, which was wonderful. And she did very well in the program. She was a student in a course we have called Ethics and Administrative Law. And she's building on that to talk about teaching values today, how we teach values. She's working at Hart House at the University of Toronto. When I was a grad student at the University of Toronto, that was my favorite place. I used to go there to do my studying and do my writing. I used to play the piano there. And she helps to organize student programs in Hart House. So Danielle, thank you very much for being with us today.
This podium is quite tall, it occurs to me, so I may step around it a lot. Maybe I'll just stand. Thank you so much for having me today. Like Ian said, my name is Danielle Thibodeau, and I am a program coordinator at Hart House at the University of Toronto. If you have any questions about what that is, please feel free to ask me afterwards. It's kind of a hard place to explain. It's not obvious what Hart House is at the start, so I'd love to tell you more about it if you'd like afterwards. I was invited here today because I was a member of the MPAL program, and I chose as my topic this very large topic, and I'm not sure why I chose it, but this topic of the same-sex curriculum, the sex ed curriculum that was introduced in Ontario schools this fall. So what we're going to talk about today, this is a good-sized group, but it's also kind of a cozy group. So I'm going to speak for a little while, and then I'm going to move this into more of a discussion, because I'm really interested in hearing people's thoughts and opinions, not only about the curriculum, but about the backlash and about how people who work in education policy can create curriculum and create policies that suit a community as diverse as the one we live in the Greater Toronto Area, in Ontario, and in Canada more generally. So that's my hope for today, is that we talk about the controversy and the challenges that arise when you're trying to create education curriculum for this kind of population. I'm going to go through some things that I think are relevant. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the point of public education is, because I think that's relevant to why we have sex ed in schools. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of multiculturalism and how that impacts the way the curriculum is rolled out. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about something else that I've forgotten, so I'm going to look at my neat thing here. Oh, right. I'm going to talk about how we think about culture. And because if we're talking about multiculturalism, we have to also figure out what we mean when we're talking about culture. So those are the things that I'm going to talk about as I see as relevant to the conversation. And then I'm just going to open it up, and we're going to talk about what other people think. Before I start talking about those things, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, because I have biases with regards to this topic, and I think that my work history is relevant to what I think about the new sex ed curriculum. So just for some context, I've been working with youth in Toronto for about 10 years now. I started working with a program in Regent Park called Pathways to Education, and I coordinated volunteers in that program who came in to tutor and to mentor youth in that neighborhood. Because of the types of questions we would get from youth, and because of the types of counseling we ended up doing with youth in that community, I ended up volunteering as a sex educator for a year with Planned Parenthood. And I did that in part because we spent so much time on the Planned Parenthood website answering questions that kids had for us that I genuinely felt like we had to give back somehow. And so I ended up getting trained and volunteering there for a year in their clinic downtown, which is a clinic for youth that specializes in sexual education and sexual health needs, but isn't only a provider of sexual health needs. Then I worked for a program that is a joint partnership between the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto and Osgoode Hall Law School here at York, called the Laws Program, which provides justice and law education for high school youth in Toronto, in particular for youth who are from communities that are not traditionally represented in the legal system. So youth of color, youth from low-income neighborhoods, first-generation youth, whatever other sort of barrier you can imagine. Those are the kind of youth we target in that program. And I think that's relevant because I do think that a lot of the issues that are being raised in the new sex ed curriculum are issues of justice. So it is a rights issue to have access to health and knowledge, and so I think that plays a lot into how I come to think about the new sex ed curriculum. And I should also say that because a lot of the backlash to the curriculum has been, at least in the media, portrayed as backlash from religious organizations, I think it's also important to note that my personal history is that I was raised by two atheists, quasi-atheists, who left their own religious communities. And so for most of my life, I participated in religion as an observer, or as a tourist almost. And so I may not feel as fervently about some of the religious beliefs that some of the communities who are protesting the same-sex curriculum are bringing to the table. And I think that's important to note just in my own experience and how I approach the topic. For those of you who haven't been following this, and has anyone not been following this? I assume you showed up today because you were kind of following this. In the spring of last year, in around March 2015, Ontario announced that they would be rolling out a new sex ed curriculum for all grades of Ontario schools. Immediately, there was backlash, and though some of that backlash was centered around, I think, a lot of misinformation about the content of the sexual education that was going to be released, there was a lot of genuine concern from certain communities about the content of the sexual education. A lot of it centered around some of the early years stuff in grade 1 and 2 that was going to be about naming body parts, so teaching young children to properly name all of their sexual organs and body parts. A lot of the other backlash related to a lot of the LGBTQ friendly and specifically like trans friendly curriculum that was going to happen sort of in middle school and the high school level. And then a lot of kind of questions about the need to include a lot of stuff really early on in the curriculum around consent. So teaching children about their bodies and about kind of their ownership of their bodies. That rumblings of protests kind of went throughout the spring. People were upset. A lot of groups formed to not only protest the curriculum, but also to support the curriculum. So there was a lot of action on both sides. In September, you probably saw a lot of images of protests at Queen's Park. On the first day of school, a lot of parents, as protest, held their kids out of school, and a lot of those people didn't just hold them up for the first day of school, they've held them out completely. At Thorncliffe Park Elementary School in Toronto, a large elementary school, 1/2 of the students who were supposed to be there on the first day weren't there. And they attribute that largely to the protest against the sex ed curriculum. It's a big number. And I read in the paper today, I was joking before I came up here that when I chose this topic, it was very much in the news cycle, and then like the election happened, and the Blue Jays happened, and Drake dropped that video, and you know, our lives went crazy. And then just this morning, front page of the Star, there was an article that said 3 teacher positions have been lost at Thorncliffe Park Elementary School because their numbers dropped so significantly this year because of parents keeping their children home because of the sex ed curriculum. So that protest is having some impact. And despite what you may have interpreted, I know that I've read some people's opinions that the protests, the images in the media have been mostly of people of color, newcomer communities, Muslim communities. If you watch closely, I would say that those protests were actually fairly representative of a lot of different people. So there were conservative Christian groups out. There were people whose backgrounds were definitely like white settler Canadians. There were people in hijabs. There were people not in hijabs. Like the cross section of people who came out to protest that curriculum was fairly diverse in a lot of ways. So it's really interesting to me, and I should point out too that the people who came out to support the curriculum were also very diverse. That there have been very strong voices from the Muslim community, from Christian communities, from newcomer communities of all stripes, really supporting the curriculum. So part of my background in research is in school choice. My master's paper here at York was about school choice in relation to religious choice. So I looked at Catholic schools and how, you know, we in Ontario support Catholic schools through the public system. Is there a better way to support religious choice through schooling? So I pay attention when people start choosing to take their kids out of school. That to me is important to think about why people are choosing that and what impact that has on us as a whole when people choose to opt out of the public school system. And the reason that is of concern to me, or the reason I pay attention to that, is because of how I feel public education, what role public education plays for all of us. So just out of curiosity, I'd love to hear from some of you just quickly, like, what do you think the point of public school is? Yes?
One of the points of having a public school is that it is the right of every child, regardless of creed, faith, color, regardless of who you are, you as a Canadian citizen should have the right to have at least a basic education, including reading, writing, arithmetic, and science and whatever else, and whatever else goes into that curriculum. And if you want to go beyond that, or whatever you want to do is your own business after a while. But the basic rights and fundamentals are there for everyone, regardless.
So I definitely agree that there's a cultural value that we agree that people have a right to education in Canada, but I'll reframe the question a little bit. So you have this right that we all sort of agree on in Canada, even though it's not in the Constitution, right? It's not in the Constitution. Education is a right. It's not, I don't believe in the Constitution. But we have this kind of cultural value that everyone should be educated to a certain point. But that reading, writing, math, science, that stuff you have to do in public school, what is the purpose of it? Like, why do we educate people? Yes, you and Greg.
To help people understand about the world and help make the world a better place, help improve Canada. You have the basic skills, reading and writing. You can read the newspaper, and even if you don't go to college or university, do any post-secondary, by reading, you get more knowledge, and then you can go further.
Yeah.
I know people who've started an own business, but are high school dropouts.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. You learn some important skills. Yes.
Also, I think the point of public education might be to decrease the ignorance that people have. I mean, by opening up ourselves to new information, people can actually connect to each other better. Like, so the point for I think for like sex education
have access to equal education, so there's a standard. So regardless of what your personal or domestic life is, at least every child has the opportunity to learn an equal standard of subjects or literacy, etc.
And I think what you've all touched on, and actually, sir, you have touched on one side of it, and then you guys kind of touched another point, is that for most educational theorists, public education serves two main functions. One is to build a skilled workforce, right? And so you talked about your friend who left high school but acquired enough basic education to start their own business and be successful. And we all know those people. And that's why we say in Ontario you have to stay in school until you're 16, but we can't force you beyond that. So there is a part of public education that is about just straight up giving people the skills to be functioning members of society. We hope you can read. We hope you can balance a checkbook. Although, as someone with a math degree, I can assure you most of you can't balance your checkbook, and that for some reason you think that's okay, but that's another day for another topic. You can read, you can balance a checkbook, you can have a conversation, these basic skills that are going to enable you to be employable. So that's part of a public education, and it's an important part. The other big part of it, and the part that I think about a lot more, is the values transmission. So what you were talking about, you want students to be open to new experiences, you want them to be understanding, you want them to not have prejudices. That's a value. And that's a value that I'll come back to you, sir. I see your hand. And that's a value that we hold in North America for education systems, but that isn't a value that is transmitted in all public education systems around the world. There are some public education systems that are focused very much on the skill development side. They just want to build a workforce. And there are other populations in the world that are transmitting different values. So in certain culture, the value that's being transmitted is an authoritarian value. Your teacher is the person who has the right answer. You respond with the answer your teacher gave you, and that's how you're learning to respect authority in that context. And in Canada, and I'd say in North America, and in most Western countries, one of the values we're transmitting, like you described, is kind of a critical thinking, openness value, right? So, and that's the point of public education that I think is the most important, and especially in the Ontario context. Because in Ontario, and in Toronto in particular, and in Canada more generally, we live in communities where people are coming from all over the world. And they're bringing a lot of different sets of values with them. And so the other basic education that we receive, which is from our families, because that's the other big site of learning values and community norms, is from our families. Those aren't always aligned with the kind of Canadian or Ontario norm. And so in Ontario, public education plays this also huge function where you're not only educating children, but you're using that education of the children to also help transmit values to the families. Sometimes that's going to be really easy. There are some communities where people come to Canada and their values align quite easily, and so there's not a big cultural shift. And for other people, some values jar, and they don't always align as simply as other groups do. So, and this is an argument too with proposals to move to like a voucher system. Does people know what I mean by a voucher system for education? No, that's fine. So a voucher system would be a system where, let's say the Ontario government decides it costs $10,000 a year to educate a child in the school system. In a voucher system, the government says, okay, well, you could send your kid to public school, and it'll cost us about $10,000 a year. Or we give you this voucher for $10,000, and you can use it to another school, right? And that has been something that's been proposed. It did happen in Ontario during the Harris government in the 90s, and it's a proposition that comes up every once in a while in Ontario. John Tory, our current mayor, lost an election, I would say, in Ontario based on his idea to do this. And even people from religious communities who sometimes opt out of the public school system will argue against vouchers because they're worried about losing that very important values transmission piece in schools. So that I just bring that to say that this is why when I see large numbers of people from certain communities pulling their kids out of school and setting up kind of very quickly set up makeshift community-based schools, as has happened in some communities because of the sex ed curriculum, I worry. Because the more you erode that base of people participating in public school, the more you erode that opportunity to transmit these group values to the next generation. Yeah?
What about the split, Catholic schools and public schools? They're both open to everyone.
They are.
But at the same time, they have different curriculums. So they have I know Catholic schools have writing, math, they're reading, but at the same time, I've spoken to some and they say that the Catholic religion is integrated into all subjects, so it transmits different values.
And I'm actually going to say I'm not going to talk about Catholic schools today because if you get me started on Catholic schools, I will literally not stop. But I would love to talk to you about that, about how that whole value transmissions project in Ontario in particular and Catholic schools works, because I have a lot of thoughts on that. But like you're right, that is an important point. So we have this big project to transmit values through our public education system. And we also in Canada have a culture of public policy based on multiculturalism. Does everybody here, feel like everyone here has spent some time in Canada in school systems, so you probably have a vague idea of what multiculturalism is. But I'll just kind of explain how I understand multiculturalism and where it came from and how I think that impacts kind of where we are with the same-sex education. So multiculturalism as a policy was really brought into full effect in the early 80s with Trudeau and the bringing home of the Constitution and the Charter of Human Rights. And the idea around multiculturalism is that some people would argue that it was just a way to start ignoring Quebec, because if there's many cultures, then there's not just English and French. There's many of us, and we all have to learn to get along. Or it was a way to court immigrants and immigration to Canada. If you come here, we're a multicultural society. But the premise of multiculturalism is that we assume a shared basic value around democracy. So we assume that people who are electing to come to Canada or are electing to flee from situations to Canada share the value of democracy, but beyond that, we're not making a lot of assumptions about our shared values. We're assuming that we share the value of democracy, and other than that, it's the government's responsibility to create sites and spaces for us to exchange our cultural values. And if you grew up in Canada and were alive, sort of like I was born right around when the Constitution was brought back to Canada, and so I grew up in a kind of multicultural landscape that, I forget the expression, but there's an expression for the type of multiculturalism. It's like saris, samosas.
3Ds.
The three, yeah.
Dinner, dining.
Dancing.
Dress and dancing.
Dinner, dress, and dancing. That if you share these things with everyone, then that's what creates this multicultural society. So, we're going to have International Day at school, and everyone's going to come in their dress from home, and everyone's going to bring their food from home. I'm sure you've all had this done to you at some point in your life. Those of us from obscure old settler Canadian communities like me, like Acadians, I spent my whole childhood in Ontario explaining to Upper Canadians who Acadians were. So there's this idea that we all share this one value, and that we're going to create these sites of exchange for these other parts of our culture. And I would argue that multiculturalism assumes culture in a very narrow sense. Okay? So when you think about multiculturalism, you think about those 3 Ds, right? The dancing, dining, dress. Dancing, dining, dress. And that your culture is linked somehow to the place that you came from, the ethnic community you belong to, the country your family came from. But if you start thinking about culture in a much broader sense, and I think it's really important for us to start doing so, you can acknowledge that we all belong to a number of cultures and communities at all times. And I think that you probably have done this because I think as university students or people engaged in academia, we're often called upon to sort of identify or locate ourselves, right? Like, so if I had to go through the list, I would say I am a white settler Canadian, I'm cisgendered, I identify as straight. You go through the list of things, and those are all communities you belong to and cultures that you belong to. And even within those ethnic communities that I think in the 80s and 90s we kind of assumed were these large homogenous masses, there are subsections, right? They're complicated groups. I often think about the debate over Afrocentric schooling in Toronto. Africa is a big place. It's a big place with very disparate cultures, and yet we were like, well, we're going to set up an Afrocentric school, and that school is going to be centered on African teaching principles. You're like, well, whose African teaching principles are we basing them on? It's a huge place. And so multiculturalism is, I think, doing us a bit of a disservice by defining culture in these really narrow ways. And I think what we see in the backlash and the confusion around the same-sex education, not the same-sex, I keep saying same-sex education because it's such a big part of the curriculum, but the sex ed curriculum is that it's assuming, it's showing us the divisions in these different cultures, right? So there are a large number of Muslim communities in Toronto, and a lot of those communities and a lot of participants in those communities are really excited about the new sex ed curriculum, and some of them are. And there are a large number of Christian communities in the area, and some of them are excited about the curriculum, and some of them aren't. And it's hard for us growing up in a space and learning in a space where culture is defined so narrowly to define those things. And when you hear people talk about it, they're often trying to set themselves apart or differentiate themselves because they'll say, well, everyone on the CBC who was featured in these protests wore a hijab, and I'm in a hijab, and I don't feel that way. Like, why can't we delineate between these two different groups of people? And I would almost say it's worth thinking about culture, clumping up different groups of people in different cultures. So for example, the group that I see as the ones who are the most against the curriculum is the culture that I've decided to call religious conservatism. And religious conservatives are, in North America, I'd say, gaining more and more sway in elections, right? The Tea Party in the States is a political party born out of religious conservatism to an extent, and they help sway elections in the United States, right? The other thing about multiculturalism that I don't think serves us very well is the idea that the underlying idea of multiculturalism is that there is no Canadian culture. So, and you hear people say that all the time. There's no Canadian food. We just, besides poutine, like we just eat the food of everyone who's here. You know, there's no real Canadian identity. The Canadian identity is that we are all these different things. Nobody cheers for Canada during the World Cup. We cheer for all these different, I'm like literally like one of the oldest settler Canadian groups in Canada. I don't even cheer for Canada during World Cup. So there's this underlying assumption that there is no Canadian identity, which on the one hand was wrong, even when it was the assumption, because obviously there was an identity, and it was primarily based on Christian values and of Western European values of the settlers who were in power at the time when the governments were formed. And I think too that there has also evolved a second Canadian identity. And the reason I think that is because of the backlash to Stephen Harper during our recent election. I think that the reason, one of the rallying points around not voting for Stephen Harper, and I don't care if you did or not, I'm not here to judge, but I think that one of the things that was apparent was that one of the ways that people felt threatened by Stephen Harper was that he was somehow threatening this nebulous Canadian identity, that Canada had lost, even though we're not supposed to have a Canadian identity, that Canada was losing its way, was losing its identity through some of the policies that had been enacted throughout the Harper government. Yeah. So why does this matter? It matters because multiculturalism isn't the only way to think about integrating cultures in a community like ours. In Quebec, though it's not written policy, the policy or the idea that underlines their sort of attack to, not attack, but like tack, I guess, culture is interculturalism. So interculturalism assumes that both parties in the new relationship, the newcomer community and the people to whom you're coming, are going to work together to interchange their cultures. And I worry using Quebec as an example of this because I don't think Quebec is doing a great job of this. But the underlying idea behind the way they treat newcomer communities and integrate new cultures is that there is a larger assumption of shared values. There is a larger assumption of what those newcomer communities have to sign up for. So the assumption is that there are a number of values that are Canadian, or in that case, Quebecois, that the newcomer should be on board with, that they should be engaging with and working towards accepting. And at the same time, the responsibility of the host community or the host province or whatever is to make sure that there are enough services and available opportunities for those people to engage in the culture. And so that is what I think is lacking here in Ontario with the sex ed curriculum. I think that we live in a culture where for years we've said we only have one shared value, and that's democracy. But we actually have more shared values, right? We have, like you've said, we have this kind of shared value of critical thinking. A lot of us assume that at school we are supposed to be questioning and thinking about our ideas. We have a shared values around safety. We have a lot of shared values around education that we don't name. And yet, when communities come in, we just kind of assume, well, they probably agree with this. We have this shared democratic value, but other than that, like, we're open to everything. I think, like, we're really not open to everything. One of the big sticking points of the new curriculum for me is this idea of consent. This idea that you need to start teaching consent at a younger and younger age, that you need to start teaching about healthy relationships at a younger and younger age. And I think that's a great idea. I think that's something we absolutely should be doing. Years and years ago, when I worked as a literacy volunteer in a women's shelter in Kingston, the women who ran the shelter told us that they had to shift their healthy relationships workshops that they would do just in the community from grade 10 to grade 5. Because by the time they were in grade 10, unhealthy relationship habits had already been ingrained in the students. And so they had to move those education sessions down to grade 5 so they could catch students before they started engaging in relationships. So the idea that we're upset, that we're putting that in the public school education is really upsetting to me, because I think that is a shared value. I think the idea that people have, dominion over their own bodies and can make choices is a shared value. But because we have this underlying idea of multiculturalism, where we're kind of saying, well, what everyone thinks is okay, we're not really able to address those conflicts and say, no, you're wrong. We do have this shared value. This is a shared value for us. And so when I've been thinking about the sex ed curriculum, I've been thinking about how we have to shift to thinking about our vastly disparate community in terms of this kind of interculturalism conversation as opposed to multiculturalism. That's what I have to say about that. Does anybody have any comments or ideas about this? I would like to hear them. Or what have you had experiences? Like, do you have younger siblings or children yourself who have been in the curriculum or have been to schools that people have been pulled from? Anyone?
Well,
Yeah.
how do you determine the shared values in a multicultural society? And who decides these? And on what basis do these people decide which values are shared?
Yeah.
Because if I see anything coming out of this sex curriculum debate, it's diversity. It's the fact that there isn't this common set of shared values about how young people should be educated in terms of sex.
I think I see both. Like, I think what has been really apparent to me is both the divisiveness that still exists, and that's why I think that we haven't done a good job of addressing it. And I should also say too that for years and years I've only heard that Canada is kind of a model for other countries in terms of multiculturalism. Like, I still think we do better at this than most places. But I think what the sex curriculum has shown us that there are some really deep divisions still that we're not addressing. But I also think that this idea around shared values has been really apparent in the diversity of the groups that are supporting the same-sex curriculum as well. So the reason, and that's kind of one of the things that made me think of, and I don't know how we create the shared values. I think in part the shared values come from a more diverse, in terms of ethnic background, religious background, cultural background, set of people working in public policy. And it heartens me that everyone here is from different communities and looks, because I think that if you can say that the people creating those policies and working on those curriculums have come from a variety of backgrounds, then you have a more legitimate leg to stand on when you say that these are the shared values that we have come up with. And they will continue to some extent to be based on the traditions of Western Christian societies, because we can't ignore that that's where our history is. Like, that's where the development of the country came from, and that's always going to shade it. But I think that the more that you have voices in the room who can say, no, we are all from these different places and we do acknowledge these shared values, I don't think it's as divisive and as hard a project. I mean, it's a hard project, but I think there will be more common ground than we expect in these spaces. And I do think, that's why I said too, that I think we need to think about our cultures differently and the connections and the groups of communities that we belong to differently. There's a neat video on the Huffington Post, and it's not produced by the Huffington Post, it's produced by a group of young women in the GTA who are all Muslim young women, and their slogan for the video is "We say no, K-N-O-W," and it's a response to protesters whose slogan was "We say no," right? So a lot of the protesters in front of Queen's Park were screaming "We say no" to sex ed, and these women have created a video, and it's got a hashtag. I think you can hashtag them, hashtag "We say no, K-N-O-W," and one of the women in the video says that her mother heard the words "religious conservatives" on the TV, right? So the CBC is talking about the story, and that her mother identified with religious conservatives. Like, her mother knew, didn't matter what color those people were, didn't matter what headscarves they were wearing or not, but that her mother saw that the religious conservatives were against the same-sex education, and that was a cue for her mother to also be against it. So I think, and that's what makes me think that it's not worth thinking anymore about. It's not, we just need to move beyond this idea that our culture is this religious or ethnic background that we came from, but rather, different ways that we engage in our religions or different ways that we engage in our cultures. I think that at York, for example, that you could say there is a culture of, and at U of T where I work as well, but I think you guys probably do a better job of identifying it than at U of T. There's a generation, like a culture of first generation students, right? That students who are the first in their families to go to university or the first in their families to go to university in Canada, that's a cultural group in a sense, right? That, or you could call it a community, whatever, but that group of people shares challenges and shares values and shares norms based on that experience, even if they all come from different countries and different backgrounds. And so that's the part where I think that we need to conceptualize of a Canadian culture in a different way, that culture is, dependent on the time you're living in, it's dependent on the place you're living in. Maybe we can't ever have a Canadian culture because the country is so big. Maybe we're talking in this case about a Toronto culture. Maybe the Toronto culture couldn't suit the same-sex curriculum in the way that the Ontario culture could. But it's worthwhile looking at these things from that perspective as opposed to just cultural groups or minority groups or religious groups being against this, because I think it's very apparent when you hear people on both sides that isn't the case. It's very specific groups or cultures within these larger communities that face challenges to it. So I mean, I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer for how can we create a shared set of Canadian values. But yeah.
Could you speak to the needs for this new curriculum? For example, a lot of people were speaking to the fact that with social media, you had 11, 12-year-old girls exposing themselves to feel like they belong or for boys to like them. They're getting younger and younger in terms of sexting. There's so much out there on bullying and sexting. And you have 10, 11-year-old girls who didn't know that they couldn't be touched that way or didn't have to be. So there was this whole Canada-wide conversation on the role of social media. And I think Ontario really looked at that stuff and said, this is their right to know.
Yeah.
Kids have to know at 4 years old that a daddy or uncle, because it's usually someone you love, is touching you the wrong way.
And that was, if you watch this video was really great. These four women do a really good job of kind of laying out their thoughts on it. They spoke to that. They definitely spoke to the idea that children early on need to understand that they own their bodies. They need the right language to speak about their bodies in case someone is touching them or is acting inappropriately towards them. And they name actually one of the challenges in particular of working in these multicultural communities where everyone, it's not just that you have weird pet names for your genitalia in the way that people, do for children. They don't teach them real words, but you have so many language groups. And so if someone is acting inappropriately to a child, that often that child can't go to school and tell the teacher where they've been touched because they just don't know the English word for it. Or, there are languages where certain areas might not have specific names because of the cultural impact of naming that space for that culture. And so I've read a couple of articles by social workers and by teachers from different communities say this is actually a big tool for us just because we need to help students be able to tell us when stuff is happening. So there's a lot of really practical things that go into why the curriculum is there. And I can tell you as someone who worked with youth for a long time, who was the person that they came to when they had pregnancy scares or needed condoms or things like that, and also as a Planned Parenthood educator. So just to explain how that worked, I was the person at Planned Parenthood that you would see before you saw your doctor. So if you were coming in to do a pregnancy test or to get birth control, you would see me first, and I would kind of tell you like how it was going to work or what was going to happen. Because for a lot of youth, doctors are intimidating, and especially in a lot of cultures, doctors are sort of up here, and you're not supposed to ask them questions. You're supposed to just believe what they say, so it's embarrassing to tell them things. And so the idea was that I was a peer educator. You would see me first. You could ask things you were embarrassed about, and I would give you the background. And I can tell you that the scariest moments for me working there were not, as people assumed, like some poor 12-year-old coming in pregnant. It was the 19-year-old who didn't know whether they were pregnant because they didn't know what sex was. Like, it was the people who were undergrads at university who lacked very basic skills about the mechanics of their own bodies. Those are the people that scared me the most when they came in, because like, oh my goodness, what have you done between like when you started doing stuff and now, and you did not know what was going on. And so those ideas are very fresh in my mind when I think about the same-sex curriculum. And also when I think about LGBTQ youth, right? When I think about youth who are transitioning, I think in general our society is becoming more open to people transitioning and identifying as gay at much earlier ages. And so that should be reflected at school. There should be institutionalized policies to allow that to happen. And right now, those things happen on a very ad hoc basis. If your school is open to it, if your Catholic school is open to it, right? And that's why I'm not going to talk about Catholic schools, because it opens a whole other thing. But those things need to be institutionalized so that people know that they are, like I said, a shared value. And so, and again, like we don't kind of make that assumption that people will buy into those values. Like I know that, so one of the things that used to happen when I was a law and justice educator is we go to high schools and we would go in particular to ESL classes, because for a lot of newcomer Canadians, their first interaction with the justice system will be a bad one. And so our goal was to try to make their first interaction a good one. And we would go in and we'd do workshops on different legal topics, mostly to give students some vocabulary around the law so that they could protect themselves a little bit. And one of the workshops was about human rights. And the workshop, we would often try to find law students who could deliver the workshops who were themselves newcomers at some point in their lives, to give the students a bit of connection there. And we had a student one day who was from a country, the same country as our presenter, who was a PhD student, a very smart guy, had already been a lawyer in his home country, came to Canada, was going to teach law. And we got to the part about LGBTQ rights. And we were explaining about how, it was your right, your sexual orientation was a right in Canada. It was acknowledged in the Ontario Human Rights Charter. It was an analogous right in the Canadian Charter. And the student who was from the same country as the presenter kind of looked at him and said, "Oh yeah, but back home, that wouldn't fly, right? Like this is some crazy garbage right here." And was very vocal about sharing his feelings that like this was just some Canadian hoo-ha, and this wouldn't fly in other parts of the world, and rightfully so, was basically his point. And the law student immediately said, "You know what, buddy? People come to Canada for rights. Like you and I have come to this Canada for rights. Most people who are coming to Canada are coming for rights and opportunities. You get one, you take the whole package. You don't get to pick and choose which rights are cool and which rights aren't. You got to take the whole package." I don't think we say that a lot as Canadians, right? I think we do have this kind of idea that we have this shared democratic value, and that everyone comes in and everyone has their right to practice their religion, their right to freedom of speech, and those are all great things. But we don't do a good job of saying, you know what, we do have some really important values that we share. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about the idea of, in an equitable society, of consent being a value. Like, is consent a value in Canada? Is that something we uphold? It's tricky sometimes, especially when you read stories about how we prosecute people who commit rape or are accused of rape and how we treat victims in those circumstances. I'm not sure I can say that consent is a shared Canadian value, but I would like it to be. And so, constructing our values a little bit different, not just constructing them around the right to practice your religion and the right to do this, but also like the right for children and women and everyone to feel safe in their bodies, which is a constitutional right, but not interpreted that way necessarily. Yeah.
How do you think that values are imparted to students, not from the teachers, but from their peers? Like, how do you think that ends up playing out, especially with sex ed?
I think back to Naomi's point that is what's happening now, is that most youth are educated from their peers, be they in-person peers or peers on the internet, or more scary, not peers on the internet. And a lot of the people, I think it's really interesting when you watch the protests. The protests are parents and small children who do not know what their t-shirts say, do not know what their signs say. You don't see a lot of 16-year-olds at those protests, right? You don't see a lot of 17, 18, 19-year-olds at those protests, because those 18, 19, 16, 17-year-olds are living it right now, and they understand how they're getting the information about sex right now, and they understand that it's not great. The Ontario sex curriculum hasn't been updated since the early 90s. We're actually, in terms of comparable jurisdictions, in Canada, North America, other places that we do education and research comparatively with, like Australia and England, we are behind on an update, really, really behind. And so, integrating things like think about, I'm looking around the room, most of you can't think about your lives in 1993 because you weren't alive. But I was alive, and I was actually sex education prime age in 1993. I was 13 years old. That's how old I am. That was a very different reality, like a very, very different reality in a lot of ways. And I would also say not a lot of ways, right? People got bullied, people learned about sex in terrible ways, people didn't understand consent then either. I think, though, because we engage with all these online spaces, and because now we as adults also engage in those online spaces, we are so much more aware of what's happening in those spaces and what we need to protect students about or educate students about, that the urgency, I think, is ramping up a lot. And but again, if we don't have that shared value around consent or about people owning their bodies, then a lot of cultures don't. A lot of cultures do not believe that a 6-year-old owns their body. They believe that child's body is property of their parents, right? So why would I teach that kid about that? Because I know I'm protecting them. Nothing bad is happening to them. They're fine. What I found really interesting was the people in the protests tend to be characterized as, like I said, newcomers, kind of old school, they're from backwards places. If you want to read about something that will kind of challenge your opinion about the people who are against the sex ed education, there is a Toronto Life article that features 3 families who are all, it's called the New Sex Warriors or something like that. And it features 3 families from the GTA who are against the curriculum, who are all very well educated, very well informed. They have read the curriculum. They are not families who have been misinformed. They know what's in the curriculum, and they are against it. They have taken their kids out of school. And for me, it was challenging for me to read that, because I kind of want to think, well, God, if you have read this, if you have thought about this, you'd be okay with it. And there were these 3 people who were not, who were still very fervent in their belief that this was an inappropriate thing. And again, what they keep coming back to is this idea of values. This is not a value that a school is supposed to teach. This is a value that we're supposed to teach at home. And I think that's kind of what I want to bring it back to, is if we reevaluate what are values for us, and we think about, well, consent is a value for us, body sovereignty is a value for us, that feminism is a value for us, and then I think that's how you justify this as a value education school. I feel like that's okay. Question.
Okay. I understand that, and I assume that everyone here knows that education is absolutely essential to one's growth, no matter what age they are. But I want to ask you, where do we draw the line as to what kids are learning today? We all know that math, science, English, these are all essential subjects to a child's growth. But do you think that sex ed is something that should be taught at school? Because in my school, my experience at school, the kids, they took the class as a joke. They said, oh, this is a very easy class, this is a joke, why should I even try in this class? Do you think it's a very good idea to put our funding and resources into this program, seeing that the class is being seen as mostly a joke from my experience?
Yeah. Now, I will counter with, okay, just a quick question. How many people here went to high school in Ontario? How many of you took grade 10 civics? How many of you thought grade 10 civics was a joke? Be honest. Okay. So would you make the same argument about civics? Would you make the same, and believe me, civics is the most failed, civics and careers, because it's half credit, that is the most failed grade 10 credits. That's bananas. Like, that is an easy course, but it's failed most often because first time teachers get stuck with it, it's boring, believe me, it is boring. It is the most failed. Everyone here thinks civics grade 10 is a joke. Would you make the same argument about grade 10 civics?
No.
Given that it's teaching us about our government and our rights and our constitution.
I would not make that same argument, seeing as in Canada, we are a multicultural country, and we can't just ignore all the different cultures in our country.
Sir, I
We
think you missed a lot of her talk on multiculturalism.
I
You
did.
can't really ask a question unless you hear the whole talk, just to be fair to the speaker as well. So let her answer.
I'm just asking questions based on my knowledge. Apologize.
I did talk
I
a lot
just
about
couldn't
multiculturalism and how we can like define multiculturalism to include that. But I would say that, you know, of all the things that we teach kids in school about their development, I do think that the development of their bodies and how to keep themselves safe and how to have healthy relationships is hugely impactful to us as a community. And so I want everyone to have the same basics about how to have healthy relationships. I mean, so even in the language we use, this is a cornerstone of how we talk about Canadians. The last election, I don't have a TV. I'm not saying that as one of those weird braggy people. I steal a lot of stuff off the internet. I'm sorry. So I don't watch a lot of commercials. And right before the election, I went to visit my parents who live in Nova Scotia, and I was watching TV at their house, and I was immediately annoyed at how often every leader was telling me about my middle-class family and how important my middle-class family was to the development of Canada. And as someone who, you know, lives with my partner in an unmarried household, you know, I'm just like, oh God. Like, you know, it's annoying after a while. But clearly we think of that grouping of people, this kind of married or quasi-married family, as important to the development of our economic structure and our nation and everything else. If all of those are dysfunctional, if people don't know how to have healthy relationships, then we don't have that very, very basic fundamental kind of societal building block, right? Like, your civilization is built on these little family units, and if all of those are dysfunctional because we have never taught people, or people are coming from households where healthy relationships aren't there, I do kind of want this space where everyone has an opportunity to learn what that could look like. Because I'm sure we can all think of examples in our lives of people who don't have that. And one really clear example of what happens when we don't have that is Canadians' Aboriginal communities, right? Because in Canada's Aboriginal communities, there was a lot of trauma perpetrated, and especially with regards to Aboriginal schools, where people were taken out of family units and then returned at some point, and a lot of those family units can't function because of that. And that's, you know, that education system perpetrated that lack of family structure. And there are huge ramifications for those communities. So yeah, I absolutely think it's worth the time and the money to help everyone have a basic understanding of what a healthy relationship looks like. Yeah.
Do you think that Ontario's a little, I would argue, ahead of other provinces in terms of sex education? Do you think that this is an example as to why we would need a national strategy for education?
Oh, that's a good question. I get nervous whenever we talk about national strategies for stuff because Canada, to me, is such a weirdly diverse country. Like you said, Toronto, is this an example? Quebec, actually, is doing a pilot version of their new sex ed curriculum this year. So instead of launching it all at once and facing, you know, a credible backlash, they're running a pilot of it this year and kind of doing it differently. So I don't know. I mean, insofar as there are kind of national strategies around health, right? And all the provinces work towards that. You know, the education systems from province to province aren't so different. Like, I think there are sort of internal benchmarks and values and standards that we uphold. And yeah, I think this is part of it. I'm really interested to see how the sex ed curriculum kind of interplays with other pieces of legislation, like the sexual harassment legislation that was introduced this week as well. Because I think there is kind of a cultural shift around how we name and deal with these issues, and I think that all of these pieces are part of it. But I would say even more so, like, the way that you would incorporate kind of national strategies around this is around criminal laws and how victims and are treated in courts, and how we relate to other kind of, how that sexual education plays into talking about assaults or sexual health in other areas. Yeah.
Daniel, I'm gonna have to take my students away back.
Do
to
it.
their
I was
class.
I was looking at the clock and I was like, I think we're about.
But I was just gonna say, I mean, it's been a very thought-provoking class, and your talk that you've given fits right into our class. The two of the most interesting courses I took as an undergrad were in religious studies, and it really opened my mind. And one of the things it taught me was that the basis of every major religion that I know of is the principle of mutual respect. That is the basis. And that's the basis of democracy as well. That's one of the reasons why we have democracy. But talking about what does mutual respect actually mean? That's the tough part. And that's something that really takes a lifetime to work through. And then we're not sure we have all the right answers. So we need that sort of dialogue. But I think one of the things that I learned from your talk today is many people don't understand their own religion. And they think they do, but they really haven't delved into it. And this is an opportunity to have dialogue in every single religion. What does mutual respect really mean? All religions tend to become institutionalized, sometimes they get corrupted, they move away from their original purpose. And so this might be a very good opportunity to debate those issues really, really seriously. So I look at a crisis as an opportunity waiting to happen. And I think that's what you showed us in this talk as well. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to lead my students back to our class, but the others of you are welcome to stay and continue talking if you wish. But I'm going to thank you right now.
Okay, as Professor Green's students are about to leave, please, if you have not already signed in at the register at the back, do on your way out of the room. And please, if you haven't already jotted down the one or two sentences on this form, please do that also. And since this appears to be the formal as compared to informal finish, let me express our appreciation tangibly by giving you this once in a lifetime opportunity to get what you can only receive by giving a talk at McLaughlin College. So you join the elect.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening.
And if any of the rest of you want to continue asking questions,
Yeah.
making points, we can do that as long as our speaker as well.